In June 1966, the 1 millionth Peugeot 404 rolled off the production line at Sochaux, in eastern France. By the time French production finally ended in 1975, 1,847,568 examples had been built at that plant alone. When you add every licensed assembly operation across Argentina, South Africa, Kenya, Australia, Canada, Chile, and a dozen other countries, the grand total reaches 2,885,374 cars. That is a number that demands respect. And yet ask most people outside France to name the great European family saloons of the 1960s, and they will give you the Volkswagen Beetle, the Mini, the Citroën DS. Ask them to name a car that won the East African Safari Rally 4 times in 6 years, once beating 84 starters when only 7 cars finished the entire event, and they will almost certainly draw a blank. That car is the Peugeot 404. Enzo Ferrari, the most demanding judge of a motor car who ever lived, owned one and drove it as his personal transport. John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth, also owned one, to the considerable amusement of his fellow Mercury astronauts. In Kenya, where the car won those safari rallies in conditions that most drivers today would struggle to imagine, it was given a name that said everything about how the local people regarded it. They called it Simba, the lion. So why, in the memory of the Western classic car world, has the 404 been reduced to a footnote? That is exactly what we are here to find out today. Section 1. France, in 1960, the world that made the 404. To understand the Peugeot 404, you need to understand what France looked like in 1960 and what Peugeot needed from this car. France, in 1960, was a country in the middle of an extraordinary transformation. The Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years of post-war economic expansion, were running at full speed. The country's gross domestic product had been growing at rates that would have seemed impossible in the austerity years just after the war. Car ownership was expanding rapidly from a luxury of the few to an expectation of the many. The French working family wanted a car that was solidly built, practical, economical, and comfortable over roads that outside Paris and the main routes nationales were still frequently rough, unpaved, and demanding of a vehicle's suspension and chassis. Peugeot had served this market faithfully for years with the 403, a capable but conservative saloon that had gone on sale in 1955. The 403 was a sound car, honest in its engineering and reliable in service. But by the end of the 1950s, its styling was looking dated and its specification modest relative to what Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and Fiat were offering. Peugeot needed something fresh. The 404 was developed during 1958 and 1959 in close collaboration with the Italian design house Pininfarina, who were, at that moment, the most sought-after automotive stylists in the world, simultaneously working with Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, and a dozen other manufacturers. What Pininfarina produced for Peugeot was a clean, crisp saloon with angular lines, a hint of American influence in its modest rear fins, a curved windscreen, and a low, purposeful stance, the result of an engineering decision to incline the 4-cylinder engine at 45 degrees in the engine bay, lowering the bonnet line and shifting the center of gravity meaningfully downward compared to the 403. The car was introduced to the press in May 1960 and presented at the Paris Motor Show that autumn, where it was immediately recognized as a significant step forward for the French company. It was, from that first moment, considered by those who drove it to be something considerably more refined than its humble mechanical specification might suggest. Section 2. The engineering. Simple, strong, and deliberately unpretentious. The Peugeot 404 was, by the standards of the European motor industry in 1960, a technically conservative car. Peugeot's engineers had never been interested in novelty for its own sake, and the 404's specification reflected that philosophy in every detail. The result was a vehicle whose qualities you could not read from a brochure, but which revealed themselves over thousands of miles of hard use. The engine was a 1,618 cubic centimeter, 4-cylinder, overhead valve unit, a wet liner cast iron block with an aluminium alloy cylinder head, inclined at 45 degrees to allow that lower bonnet line. In carbureted form at launch, it produced 72 metric horsepower. The 4-speed manual gearbox was operated via a column-mounted shifter with a gate arrangement that confused many drivers coming from other European cars, since the shift pattern placed first gear down and second up, with third down and fourth up toward the wheel identical to the layout used on the earlier 403. This pattern was not a mistake or an oversight. It was what French drivers expected, and most adapted to it quickly. Later in production, the BA7 gearbox, with a conventional floor-mounted shift, replaced the column arrangement. The front suspension was where the 404 made one of its most significant engineering statements. Peugeot had used transverse leaf springs with lever arm dampers on the 403. The 404 adopted McPherson struts, a design developed by the Ford engineer Earl McPherson, served by a carefully engineered two-piece wishbone lower arm with what Peugeot called Articone rubber bushings that provided exceptional isolation from road shock. The rear suspension retained a solid axle with a coil-sprung arrangement located by a rigid torque tube driving through a worm and pinion differential. This was not glamorous engineering, but Peugeot's chassis team, believed by those who drove the car carefully to have incorporated a degree of longitudinal compliance into the rear suspension, calibrated the whole system with such care that the result was, as the Driven to Right Automotive history site recorded, a combination of superb ride comfort and accurate handling, which belied its on-paper lack of sophistication. In plain language, the 404 rode over bad roads the way expensive cars were supposed to ride. It absorbed French rural roads, African dirt tracks, Argentine pampas, and Australian outback corrugations with equal composure, and it did so without the mechanical complexity that makes such composure expensive to maintain. Drum brakes were fitted front and rear at launch. Front disc brakes were not standardized on all petrol models until 1969. The 1,948 cubic centimeter diesel engine, one of the most important variants in the 404's history, arrived in 1964 for general sale, following earlier lower-powered administrative versions for taxi operators. Peugeot was, alongside Mercedes-Benz, one of only two manufacturers pioneering large-scale production of diesel passenger cars during the 1960s, and that diesel 404 would become the backbone of the French taxi industry for years. When Autocar magazine tested the diesel variant in November 1965, they found a top speed of 81 miles per hour and acceleration from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 25.5 seconds. With an overall fuel consumption of 32.2 miles per imperial gallon. In that same test, Autocar compared it directly against the petrol 404, which they had recently tested separately, and found the petrol version reached 88 miles per hour, completed 0 to 60 in 20 seconds, and returned an identical 32.2 miles per imperial gallon. That both versions of the car should return the same overall fuel figure was remarkable, and it confirmed what experienced drivers already knew. The 404 was, in everyday use, an extraordinarily economical car for its size. Every 404 was also delivered with a folding starting crank in the boot and a hole in the front bodywork to receive it. On a cold morning in Nairobi, in a mountain village in the Argentine Andes, or simply in a suburban Paris street with a flat battery, that crank would start the engine in seconds. It was a detail that other manufacturers had abandoned as old-fashioned. In the field, it was simply invaluable. Section 3. The Kugelfischer injection and the coupe. When the lion showed its claws. The 404's reputation rested primarily on its durability and ride quality. But there was a second, considerably more glamorous dimension to the car's story, one that brought Peugeot into contact with technology that was, in 1962, genuinely at the leading edge of automotive engineering. In 1962, Peugeot introduced mechanical fuel injection on the 404, making it the first French manufacturer to offer this technology on a production car. The system used was the Kugelfischer mechanical injection pump, developed in Bavaria by the firm of Kugelfischer Georg Schaefer, which had been collaborating with Peugeot since 1956 to adapt the technology for passenger car use. The Kugelfischer system was a mechanical masterpiece, a tiny precision pump with one piston per engine cylinder, metering fuel directly into the intake port just upstream of each valve, with a precision and consistency that the carburetors of the period simply could not match. The same basic Kugelfischer system would later appear on the BMW 2002 Ti, and the pump's underlying architecture would be studied and in part absorbed by Bosch as they developed their own subsequent injection technology. In the fuel-injected 404 saloon, the XCKF engine produced 85 brake horsepower and was rated at a top speed of 155 km per hour, 96 miles per hour. In the final KF2 specification, output climbed to 96 metric horsepower. But it was in the coupe that the injected engine truly found its natural home. The 404 coupe was introduced at the Paris Salon in October 1962 and went on sale in 1963. Its body was built, not at Sochaux, but at Pininfarina's own workshops in Grugliasco near Turin. The bare floor pan and mechanical components were assembled at Sochaux, loaded onto a train to Italy, where the coupe bodies and their complete Italian-built interiors were added, and then the finished cars were returned by train to France for final mechanical commissioning. It was a production process of considerable complexity and expense, and the result was a car of corresponding distinction. Motor Magazine tested the 404 coupe with the KF2 injection engine in December 1965, and the article carried the headline, "A first-class job." The test figures confirmed the headline, 0 to 60 miles per hour in 12.2 seconds, the standing quarter mile in 18.8 seconds, and a top speed of 105.2 miles per hour. Fuel consumption over the test was 23.8 miles per imperial gallon, which the tester noted would likely have improved over a longer distance. Motor also noted, with some precision, that the punitive British purchase taxes of the 1960s made the coupe equivalent in price to a Jaguar Mark X in the British market. In America, the 404 convertible was priced at $3,899 in 1965, putting it in exactly the same price bracket as the Jaguar E-Type in the American. That comparison was not lost on either buyers or journalists at the time. The convertible and coupe together totaled 17,223 cars across their entire production run to October 1968, comprising 10,387 convertibles and 6,837 coupes. Of those, the Peugeot 404 Club Worldwide Registry has, at last count, positively identified approximately 2,371 surviving examples, approximately 13.8% of original production. Section 4. Simba, the car that conquered Africa. No story about the Peugeot 404 can be told honestly without extended reference to the East African Safari Rally, because it was in those extraordinary events that the car's character was defined for a generation. The East African Safari Rally, created in 1953 as the Coronation Safari to mark the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, was, by the mid-1960s, the most demanding endurance rally on Earth. Typically run from Nairobi in Kenya over 2 long loops, one into Uganda and one into what was then Tanganyika, the event covered approximately 3,000 miles, mostly on unsurfaced roads and tracks, over 5 days. The conditions routinely included roaming wildlife, rock-strewn tracks, baking heat, blinding dust, torrential monsoon rain, flash floods, and thick mud that could swallow a car to its axles. In 1963, out of 87 cars that started the event, only 7 were classified as finishers. One of those 7 was the Peugeot 404 of Nick Nowicki and Paddy Cliff, entered by Marshalls, the Kenyan Peugeot importer. They won outright. It was the first time a French car had ever won the East African Safari. In 1966, Burt Shankland and Chris Rothwell of Tanzania Driving for Tanganyika Motors, the local Peugeot importer, won in their fuel-injected 404. Shankland, after the victory, told the press, "I've participated in 8 safari rallies, but I've never had to run in such difficult conditions. We drove in mud for hundreds of miles at a time. In some places, our car was swimming in over 3 feet of water." Shankland and Rothwell won again in 1967. In 1968, Nowicki and Cliff reclaimed the victory in their injected 404. 4 outright wins. In the 3 consecutive victories of 1966 through 1968, the 404 in fuel-injected form beat Ford's Works Cortina team, the Volvo Amazon, the Datsun, the Mercedes-Benz, every major European and Japanese manufacturer that sent cars to this event. The 1967 edition produced one of the most remarkable results in the rally's history. All 12 Peugeot 404s entered were classified as finishers. In an event where the majority of the field routinely failed to reach the finish line, a 100% completion rate from 12 cars was not competence. It was proof of something deeper. The car earned its name. In Kenya, the 404 has been called Simba the Lion for 60 years. Taxi versions and pickup variants are still working vehicles on the streets of northern and western Africa today. Licensed production of the sedan in Kenya continued until 1989. The pickup was still being manufactured there in 1989 also. The sedan continued in South Africa until the end of 1978, and in Argentina, where 162,583 examples were assembled by the firm of Safra at El Palomar, outside Buenos Aires, production ran on until the late 1970s. Section 5. Why it was forgotten and where it stands today. The Peugeot 404's relative absence from the Western classic car consciousness can be explained by a set of factors that have nothing to do with the car's qualities and everything to do with the mechanics of how automotive memory works. In Britain, the car was always an import interesting to those who sought out European alternatives, but never part of the fabric of everyday family motoring in the way the Ford Cortina or the Vauxhall Victor were. In America, sales were modest. The fuel-injected variants were never officially imported to the United States at all. The carburetted saloon and the convertible found buyers, but the numbers were modest compared to the Volkswagen Beetle's penetration of the American market. In France itself, the car's successor, the 504, introduced in 1968, gradually absorbed the 404's market position, and by the time European production ended at Sochaux in May 1975, the 404 was being produced at minimal volume, with only 15,780 examples built in the first 5 months of that year. The car that defined its era in Africa, that won on the world's toughest rally circuit 4 times, that Enzo Ferrari drove as his personal transport, was simply not visible enough in the markets that write automotive history. The British car press wrote about British cars, the American press wrote about American cars, and the Volkswagen Beetle. France celebrated its own heritage differently from the English-speaking world. What survives today is testimony to how deeply the 404 embedded itself in the places where it actually worked. Of the coupés and cabriolets, those exquisite Pininfarina 2-door models built partly in Turin, fewer than 14% of original production, has been positively identified by the International Registry. These are genuinely rare cars, and the best examples command prices that reflect both their scarcity and the growing recognition that the 404 Coupé is one of the most elegantly resolved French cars of the 1960s. The saloon and estate survivors exist in modest numbers in Europe, in rather greater numbers in Africa and South America. In Australia, where the 404 was assembled locally, and where its reputation for coping with demanding conditions was documented extensively in the motoring press of the period, there is a dedicated collector following that has maintained the car's memory with fidelity. The Peugeot 404 was a car of almost paradoxical character. It was conservative, methodical, and deeply French in its engineering priorities: comfort and durability first, performance and excitement second. And yet it won the world's most brutal rally 4 times. It was styled by the same Italian house that designed Ferraris. It was driven by Enzo Ferrari. It was built under license on 5 continents for 30 years. It is still working in Africa today. The numbers are all you really need. 2,885,374 cars. 4 East African safari victories in 6 years, beating the factory teams of Ford and every other major manufacturer that dared to enter. A 100% finishing record across 12 entered cars in a rally where the majority of the field failed to reach the finish line. A diesel endurance record of 16,627 kilometers at an average of 161 kilometers per hour. Sustained for 103 hours at the Montlhéry banked track in June 1965. A car that was called the Lion by people who lived in lion country, knew what the word meant, and applied it without irony. That is not a forgotten car. That is a car that the wrong people forgot. The right people, the mechanics in Nairobi and Buenos Aires and Sochaux who kept them running, the safari crew of Shankland and Rothwell who pushed one through 3 feet of mud for 5 days and still won. The collectors who understand that the rarest 404 coupes are among the most undervalued classic cars on the European market today. They have not forgotten it. Not for a moment. Now we want to hear from you. Did you ever drive a 404? Did your family own one? In France, in Britain, in Africa, or anywhere else in the world where this car left its mark? Has anyone out there watched one of those safari rallies, or ridden in a Paris taxi powered by that thumping engine or diesel? Tell us in the comments below. If this video has been worth your time, please give it a like. It genuinely helps us reach more people who share this passion for the cars that shape the world's roads, not just the posters on its walls. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so now. There are many more stories ahead. Thank you, sincerely, for watching.